Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Hello, mega orderers. I have great news. Our May 14th event at RUSI, which starts at 5:30 in Whitehall at RUSI's flagship location, is now open to all listeners of the Disorder podcast, not just those who are members of our paid Substack. You can follow the link in the show notes to register with RUSI and attend for free. You can also send it to all your friends. We are trying to fill up their 200-plus seat hall, and we think you're really going to enjoy as Jane and I discuss global financial disorder with Tom Keating, the head of the Center for Financial Security and all those kind of interesting matters, discussing some of our favorite topics like corruption and tax havens and kleptocracy and how financial matters bear directly upon what's going on with Trump and disorder. Follow the money and you will find the crypto corruption, as they say. Ergo, please join us. Follow the links in the show notes. See you there.
We're seeing quite a lot of younger people coming through that are quite interesting, not necessarily dynamic, not necessarily with new ideas. And that's where that whole idea of the Putin system that will outlast him comes in, because these are people that owe their entire careers to Putin. Most of their lives have been under his stewardship. These are people that he has, some of them whom he's kind of groomed for power, some of them who just don't know anything different. And it's a system that rewards loyalty above else, but not really new ideas.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the show where we try to make a slight semblance of order out of our mad world. Or if there isn't even a semblance of order to be made out of the disorder that we find ourselves in, then this is the show where we are willing to point fingers and call mega disorderers for what they are. It has long been our contention on this pod that Russia is in fact the world's top table disordering power. It makes a whole range of decisions not to maximize its own interests, but rather merely to disorder the global system. And therefore, again, as we have done with Bill Browder, with Evgenia Karamurza, with other of my top favorite guests, we're going to look deeper at Russia. What makes Russia tick? Why does its internal structures lead to its wishing to disorder not only its neighbors, but the global system? To help me dig deeper and to search for answers, I'm joined by Emily Ferris. She's Senior Research Fellow in the International Security Studies Department at RUSI, specializing in Russian domestic politics. Before joining RUSI in 2018, Emily worked at Control Risks, focusing on helping clients conduct business in Russia and understand what's going on there internally. Prior to that, she's worked and traveled extensively across Russia. And fantastically, she has an expertise and has studied Russian organized crime. Welcome to Disorder, Emily.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Emily, we don't hear so much in the mainstream media about what's actually going on in Russia. I think in the early days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we heard about dissidents in the streets and we heard about protests. But then even when Navalny was killed, we haven't heard much about protests in Russia other than, military-age men who run away to Georgia and Armenia. What is going on with kind of the domestic opposition scene in Russia these days?
Well, probably the reason we haven't heard so much about it is because it's not happening. I think a lot of us thought that there would be that sort of biting point in Russian society, and there hasn't been. That doesn't mean to say that people don't protest, but it tends to be in a sort of piecemeal way. There's no real actual sort of organized opposition that can advocate for these people. So you mentioned Navalny, but, a lot of his organizations, a lot of the people were targeted by the authorities. A lot of them have been shut down, their offices across Russia. So it's actually quite difficult for there to be a kind of creative outlet for this. And then you've got, of course, the security services that are a very highly functioning, well-oiled tool of the Kremlin's domestic policy. And they're very able to target people, especially those that are critical, first and foremost, of Putin himself, and second of all, of the war. So since the war began, the Kremlin has been legislating quite aggressively against any kind of opposition to not only the war itself, but any kind of criticism of the armed forces, any criticism of the Ministry of Defense, to the point that they have actually really put people in prison for quite a long time for very minor things like liking things on Facebook and social media posts. So the levels of intimidation that people have to sort of endure just to be able to make, say, a point that in a free democratic society like ours would just be a protest march that people might go to of a Sunday really carries quite big risks.
In this lightning round, I'm going to just say an idea, a person, a concept, and I want you to tell me what you think about them, what they're up to, how they bear on our topic. Mishustin.
Oh, Prime Minister Mishustin, capable pair of hands. You don't hear very much about him. Doesn't seem like he's particularly a major player at the moment. There's a lot more powerful and interesting people than him.
Shoigu.
Well, really interesting character. Former Ministry of Defense, famously, we thought fired last year because of the way that the war was going, but actually was he? Now he's kind of come back. He's got his own portfolio looking at China and Iran. He seems to have a role in foreign policy. So actually, where do people retire to? It seems like they don't really leave the system.
Iran. What is the role of Iran in, the manufacturing of the drones and in helping the Putin war effort? How is that leading to dynamics now?
Yep. Really important middle power, major part of Russian policy as enshrined by its own foreign policy doctrine of 2023. They're constructing loads of railways, the North-South Transport Corridor, to try to create sort of oil for arms deals. They definitely see that as a springboard to further cooperation with the Middle East, but slightly problematic for Russia's relationship with Israel.
Syria, and particularly the fact that the new Syrian regime under Ahmed Ashara has not really cracked down on Russia and Russian interests.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot to play there. It looked like Russia was going to lose its bases at Khmeimim and Latakia, but seems not. I think they're playing a relatively low-profile role at the moment because they're still sounding out what that regime is going to look like. Especially Russia's very nervous of any kind of terrorism-related blowback, like there was in 2015 when Russia got involved in the civil war in Syria. And there was quite a lot of terrorist activity in Russia as a result. So I think Russia's trying to have a low profile, but still maintain its political and military interests there.
The trade war. I see Russia as a net beneficiary from the trade war. They barely do international trade other than with oil and gas, so they're very happy, to my mind, with the disordering implications of the Trumpian trade war. How do you see it?
There actually are quite a few impacts from Russia as well, because it's not really as divorced from the global system as we think, as the sanctions actually really showed us. So changes to oil prices, and they were going down quite a bit, have a huge impact on Russia, given that half of its GDP is just from hydrocarbons alone. So any kind of massive change to things like dollars and things actually really do have an impact on Russia. And Russia's still quite plugged into the global trade, not just with oil and gas, but also mining and other kind of precious metals. So, and a great deal of that does actually end up in Europe.
100%. I mean, if you would tank the global economy, the Russians couldn't wage the war anymore. That's kind of well known. So that's a very interesting point there, Emily. J.D. Vance. I mean, some people say he's the one with the brains, and yet he's the one who seems the most ideologically connected to Putin. Trump, he likes another strongman. He wants to be Putin. It's not clear that he really is himself in line with the Putinist vision. But J.D. Vance, maybe even more than Orban, seems to encapsulate everything that the Kremlin wants in its global ideological vision. How do you see him playing into the U.S. Russia relationship?
It's complicated. I mean, it's possible really that he doesn't quite understand what the Russians are actually asking, because a lot of that is at the expense of America in the end. So it seems that, perhaps on paper, Russian and American interests, as ill-defined as they are, might be temporarily converging. But I think there's a great deal of divergence there. And as we can see from the way that negotiations are going, when Trump will finally probably tire of Russia's efforts to sort of spin this out as much as they can, and they will have to at some point crack down on it, unfortunately. And it might be that the relationship starts to sour.
Yes, because there's always a threat that Trump will say, hey, I like you, Putin, and we're disappointed that Zelensky wouldn't give you Crimea, but you guys didn't exactly do your bit to try to bring this ceasefire about. I mean, it would be nice to think that the Trump administration has the ability to adjudicate fairly who is responsible for the breakdown in the talks, and that therefore the Russians should bear some of that blame. I'll believe that when I see it. Continuing in the lightning round, tell us, who are the people we should be watching in a kind of broader Kremlinology? Who are the movers and shakers other than the names that we know?
So some of the regional governors in particular, some of the ones in Siberia, I know that sounds not particularly interesting, but some of these people have huge networks, huge access to...
I find it very interesting. I have always wanted to know about Tomsk and such places.
You would if you'd been there. It's lovely.
So tell us about them. What's up with some Siberian governors?
Well, regional governors have been given a huge amount of responsibility, a degree of autonomy, but that responsibility is getting much greater. So it's been, since COVID, they were in charge of whether to have regional lockdowns. They were in charge of these national projects, which is a big sort of pet Putin project where you try to get the cornerstone of the Russian economy moving with these like specific plans. Now they've been given to another department because they've actually not done so well. But regional governors have a huge amount of responsibility for budgets, for things that go on in their regions, for huge industries. So it's always good to kind of keep an eye on the kinds of people that are moving through the ranks, whether these are, it used to be security services people were promoted. Then it was sort of technocrats, people who were actually quite good at their jobs. So managers and people that were in oil and gas. Now it's actually family connections that seem to be the thing. Across the Duma, you can see people's sons starting to be moved into really quite senior positions. That's quite unusual.
That's fascinating because it shows what I assert about neopopulism, which is that neopopulism becomes about loyalty. And that if you look at a difference between Trump 2.0 and the first term, is that now it's only just about people who have loyalty. And we see this in other regimes, that the more certain kind of dictatorships continue, the more gerontocratic and loyalty-based they become.
I think it's a good point about the loyalty. It's possible that the reason that lots of these younger guys are coming through, and they mostly are men, and the reason is because family ties will trump any kind of other loyalty. It's true. I do wonder, though, yes, during the Soviet period, there was a degree of gerontocracy, but I think that is sort of over. I think that the average age of the governors is sort of, 40s and 50s. I don't think we're seeing quite a lot of younger people coming through that are quite interesting, not necessarily dynamic, not necessarily with new ideas. And that's where that whole idea of the Putin system that will outlast him comes in, because these are people that owe their entire careers to Putin. Most of their lives have been under his stewardship. These are people that he has, some of them whom he's kind of groomed for power, some of them who just don't know anything different. And it's a system that rewards loyalty above else, but not really new ideas.
Yes, the system is very entrenched, Emily, so that if we would zoom out and look at Russia, it's not just like if you lop the head off Putin, oh, we can have a new regime easily. Quite the opposite. We're in a situation where the Putinist system controls every aspect of the economy and the institutions, and that there are Putinists at every level, whether it's governors of Siberian regions or who's an oligarch or who was able to become the professor of this, that, and the other. The Putinist ideology is everywhere, and it would be probably as difficult to de-Putinify Russia as it would be to de-Baathify Iraq after Saddam. Do you agree?
Yes, I do, yes.
How would you compare the Russian internal security apparatus and its ability to spy on its own citizens with, say, the Chinese?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly what we do know is that the Russian security services and the Chinese security services learn from each other. That's true across the board in terms of Russian and Chinese activities. There's a lot of sharing in science, in engineering. During the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of, I think, shared conversations about how to manage it. I think there's actually quite a similarity about how the two think about managing each other's countries. So a highly centralized and personalized leadership, tight control over the population, information control, restrictions on freedom of movement and protest, like we were talking about. All of those things are kind of similar. Certainly, the FSB, which is the Federal Security Services, the successor to the KGB, what they do is they really prioritize going after political dissidents, anybody who seems like they have a kind of at least pro-Ukrainian bent at all. Those are prioritized over, say, looking at terrorism, which is why actually you have a little bit of a resurgence during the Ukraine war of domestic security attacks, lots of terrorist attacks across Russia, not been very much reported. It's those kind of things that mean there's been a bit of a focus, I think, from the Kremlin side on the front and on the war. And that's led to quite a lot of security gaps domestically, which is presenting quite a real danger, as you can see, to the Russian people.
And on the security gaps domestically, obviously we saw that Prigozhin could go from Rostov-on-Don all the way towards Moscow quite easily. Drilling deeper into the question of how the security services crack down and how opposition works, what about young men who flee the country, right? We have heard that there's 1 million Russian men in Armenia and Georgia and the Baltics, and that now they can go to the Caucasus much easier than the Baltics. How has that hurt the Russian economy? Because we also hear that Russia has economically bounced back and that it has this kind of permanent war economy now where 40% of GDP is focused on the defense and ancillary industries and that that's somehow sustainable. How can those things coexist?
Well, there's a few different things. So on the demography side, yes, lots of young Russian men try to dodge the draft and move to Caucasus countries where Russian is widely spoken. So it's much easier for them to get a job, work remotely, much easier to settle. So some of those people have gone back. There have been exemptions as well, by the way, in Russia for men of a certain age on a certain technicality with specialities, because they understand, of course, that they don't really want to lose a lot of their well-educated people to
And we've heard that particularly if you happen to be from a middle-class family in Moscow and St. Petersburg, what do you know? You get one of those exemptions.
Absolutely, because Moscow and St. Petersburg have per capita the lowest number of drafts when you compare it to the rest of the country. What the Kremlin has done is actually they've disproportionately taken from ethnic republics like Buryatia, which is a republic where there's lots of ethnic Buryat people, from small villages in places like Yakutia, where people are rather spread out and dispersed. So it's not so likely that they'll sort of form protests. And also, it's obviously geographically quite far away from the Kremlin, so it's difficult for them to have any kind of political impact. So there has been some design in the way that they've mobilized these men. Now, when it comes to the war economy, the Russian economy I would probably describe as surviving. I don't think it's a thriving economy. The truth is probably somewhere in between the kind of catastrophic predictions of imminent collapse and the Russian version, which is that it's absolutely booming. So the reality is it's doing okay. Obviously, you don't have a huge amount of foreign investment. So this is an economy that's not really driving itself forward. The focus on the war obviously means that, yes, there are lots of things and industries that have been reorientated to try to push the war forward. They've got this rainy day fund, the National Welfare Fund, that they can draw down from. Obviously, it's not a good idea to use it, but they do have it if they need to. And very tight banking policies by the chief of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina. And, she's not a very popular person, but actually she does a pretty good job. So I think there's probably a view that if the Russians wanted to, they could carry this on for at least a few more years. Whether they do want to is another question altogether.
I think that's it exactly, Emily. If Putin sees that he can achieve various of his aims while stopping the war, then he can stay in power and he will use overtures from the Trump administration to try to get his aims cemented into some kind of settlement. And it would seem from what we have heard from other guests that, they have a 2 to 3 year horizon because so many men are going through the meat grinder and they only have so much funds that they can draw down and their infrastructure is only so and so strong. And in theory, if the West had really supported Ukraine, it could outlast Russia. But with lackluster support, particularly American funding being withdrawn in certain ways, the Ukrainians, they won't be able to last that distance. The Russians may make incremental gains and then be able to settle from a point of advantage. The issue of settling from a point of advantage leads to us thinking about Trump's desire to mediate a peace or ceasefire, and particularly, I guess, the man of the hour, Witkoff, who seems to be just running the show. We're constantly trying to second guess what's really on his mind. It appears to me that either because Witkoff himself wants it or because Trump has told him to want it, they are advocating a very pro-Russian solution that Crimea would be acknowledged as, legitimately a part of Russia, and that all of the illegalities that happened in 2014 and elsewhere would be kind of grandfathered in, and territory gained would, be allowed to stay in Russia. I mean, why would Putin not just go for the deal, as it were, that Witkoff and Trump are presenting, because it's so inherently pro-Russian?
It could be. And at least what I can see from the Russian side is I think they're trying to probe a little bit how far the Americans will go. And you can see that in a few different places. So you see the appointment of various people like Kirill Dmitriev. He's the head of RDIF, which is Russia's direct investment fund. He's one of the chief negotiators with the Americans. And that sounds like a strange choice, but Russia has chosen people that lived and worked in the States, people that speak English very well, people that really the Americans can understand and get along with. And I think what you see is they're really kind of sounding out the Trump team, because Trump is a bit of a wild card still for the Russians. He's still unpredictable. In that sense, not much has changed from their 2016 interactions with the Americans. They still don't know sort of how he'll react to things. They don't know really what is actually on the table. That could be withdrawn at any moment. So the details of the deal aren't quite clear. I think they haven't really been super publicized, except these vague allusions to different types of territories. But what you can certainly see from the Russian side is they're trying to get as much as they can. So what they want, obviously, is Crimea. Putin has suggested these very maximalist ideas about all 4 territories.
And the 4 territories, that's like different areas of the Donbass, meaning like the Luhansk People's Republic and each of the oblasts?
Yes, although, where the front line is sort of a mixture of all of those territories. What he said as a maximalized claim is that he wants those entire geographic regions, which is a huge chunk of Ukraine. And obviously, that seems like a bit of one of those sort of opening salvos where it looks like probably the Russians would be prepared for where the contact line is at the moment, where the front line is, where the fighting stops. They'd probably be content with those territories. But then comes the really problematic question about how do you man those borders? Who looks after it? Who maintains it? How can you maintain a ceasefire in a war that's still quite hot?
Those technicalities are extremely interesting. But getting back to the larger point, it would seem that obviously Trump was never going to make peace in Ukraine, just like he's not going to turn Gaza into a Riviera and have 5-star hotels there. The whole thing has been a ridiculous exercise. What I'm trying to drill down at is, why is it that Putin has not very convincingly played the process to make it seem like, what do you know, we are willing to accommodate everything that the brilliant negotiator, the orange orangutan, has wanted, and it's this guy, Zelensky, he's the one who didn't compromise. Of course, the things that he was asked to compromise on are ridiculous and illegal, and of course he can't compromise on them. But it seems quite bizarre to me that either at the Saudi meetings or this recent London meeting, the Russians haven't coherently played the international media to say, we accept everything.
I think there's probably 2 reasons. The first is more fundamental. I think it's a matter of trust. So the trust between the Americans and Russians is at an all-time low. And just because
Wait a second, we need to pause there. Doesn't Witkoff just love Putin and he wants to kiss his ass, and Putin gave the oil painting to Trump, and it seems like trust is at quite a high?
I think those gestures are interesting. I don't know that they really speak to a sort of degree of willingness to be open and share in a real way. You're talking about trying to get rid of decades of really problematic relationship. And just because a new administration, this is not Russia's first time dealing with Trump. And actually, the relationship in 2016, when Trump was first in office, was still not much better. There were still sanctions on Russia, and the Russians remember that. And they don't think that Trump has suddenly had a personality transplant. And just because he's talking about peace, they recognize that for Trump to be the one that clinches that deal is in America's interest.
I would disagree with that. I mean, we're going to drill down later in this podcast exactly into the question of interests. There is a perception, potentially, of a media win or some kind of narrative benefit, but it is not in America's interest. And when we're going to talk about Russia as a disorderer, the framing of the episode, I would say that Putin is similar to Trump in that he pursues a range of policies which are not in the national interest. I would argue that what makes the global enduring disorder a unique historical period is having so many top table leaders, in fact, maybe the most powerful leaders in the world, all pursuing things which are not in their nation's interests.
Yes, well, it's very difficult to determine what is in Russia's national interest, what's in Putin's national interest, what's in the oligarchs' national interest, and all of those people combined makes up a sort of picture of what benefits Russia as a whole. Russia's very place in the world, the reason that it believes it's such an important country means that it feels it's exempt from a lot of things like the rules-based system. It means that it feels that it should be treated with a degree of respect, and due to its geographic size, due to its natural resources, its power as somebody with a nuclear status, all of these things wrapped in a bow of what Putin calls Russian traditional values. It's very difficult to define. It's very difficult to understand what is meant by all of this. But Russia describes itself as a sort of Euro-Eurasian Pacific power. So it feels that it is at the center of a kind of huge nexus of geography that makes it a major power and therefore needs to be treated with the level of respect that it deserves. So to go back to what you were talking about, whether the Russians trust the Americans and why they don't sort of just accept offers, I think they want to see first what they can get. They don't want the front line to stop where it is at the moment because Russia is not currently in control of its southern border. So that would be dangerous. And second of all, they really want to hammer home that any ceasefire agreement, any settlement is in Russia's interest, whatever that collection of possibilities might involve. And it's very difficult to know what Moscow's red lines are. They've kept changing throughout this war. It's something that I think a lot of us have been trying to probe and trying to understand.
Well, I would say it's easy to understand. They merely want to disorder the globe, and they want to disorder their near abroad. He doesn't want to bring into being a Putinist economic system in Ukraine because there is no such thing. If they had won the war, they wouldn't be able to export a coherent ideology. They're just happy for this to keep Europe divided and disordered. And I'm not sure about the idea that there's low trust with the Trump administration and Witkoff in particular. They may dislike Marco Rubio because they understand who he is really, even though he's playing the role of just being a crony, an acolyte of Trump's, but they fully understand that Vance and Witkoff are in their pocket. This is my analysis. And therefore, the reason that they haven't settled, oh, yes, we accept everything on the peace plan, is because they think they can get more. They simply think that they can kind of out-negotiate them, and then, these very silly pro-Putin Americans will actually just give them even more stuff and even more media wins. So they may be even holding out for a greater victory. I think that might be a mistake, because if they had seemed completely malleable and embraced the relationship with Trump, Witkoff, and Vance, I think that then they would have a new kind of bizarre alliance where they had simply flipped the White House and they could use the White House as their tool. They haven't, to my mind, brought that about as coherently as they might have.
And possibly that's because that wasn't the plan. I wonder if they were a bit surprised by things like Trump coming out quite quickly and saying, okay, here's a proposal. Things have moved quite fast. The speed with which I think Trump thought he would bring everybody to the table and everything to a conclusion did not match the Russians' timeline. I think they're still playing catch up. So I think their response is Putin has always been the kind of person that needs to take a lot of time to think about things. He doesn't respond to ultimatums. He doesn't respond to time limits. So when you think about it, from the American perspective, I can see why it seems strange that the Russians don't immediately take what's being offered. Trust might be somewhere in the mix with it, but I wonder if it's just that they are trying to sound out what they can get. They're trying to make their own decisions in their own time and within their own sort of reality. But I don't think that Russia has a sort of blind imperial desire, for example, to restore the entire Soviet Union, which is an argument I think a lot of people tend to make. There is a distinction, for example, between Ukraine, Belarus, and the rest of former Soviet Union countries. So the way that Russia sees Ukraine and Belarus is as a part of Russian territory. They've made that very clear. Will they stop after whatever ceasefire has been agreed? I don't think so.
After the break, I'm back with Emily Ferris talking Russia. Okay, you've painted a very nuanced picture, Emily, of an amorphous Ruski Mir ideology, a desire for going back to traditional values, and then there is just, the needs of the moment. And the needs of the moment may be, as you have written, to have this conflict because otherwise the security services or other discontents inside Russia would have boiled to a point that it would have been difficult for Putin to remain in power. I think that you have an interesting article that we're going to put in the show notes about changes in the Russian security sector on the eve of the invasion. Could you tell us more about how the internal Russian security sector was changing and pressures that the regime might have felt before February of 2022?
Sure. One of the things that people, I think, perhaps overlook, because Russia seems to be this sort of perhaps monolithic and a little closed of a system. But things like the Russian police force are under a huge amount of pressure. And the reason this is important is when people come back from the war, potentially traumatized, you've got a huge demobilization of people. We don't know when that's going to happen, by the way, but Russia is going to need to be prepared for it, to integrate people back into society, to make sure that a lot of the prisoners, some of which were convicted for very violent crimes, who were sent to the front, don't come back and reoffend. And the problem is that you've got a police force that is hugely under pressure. It's a very difficult and demanding job, very poorly paid, huge amounts of corruption. There's a huge amount of police suicides. All of these things kind of factor into a lot of the kind of social forces that are keeping things at bay. So these are some of the pressures that the Kremlin's going to have to contend with, I think, when people come back from the war. They are trying to think this through a little bit. What you're seeing at the moment really is the Kremlin trying to get veterans into politics. It's a bit of, I think, a bit of a fantasy from Putin's perspective that he said that he would like to see more people in politics who are former veterans. And you can see a lot of the politicians regionally trying to keep them out. So one of the things we do quite a bit at RUSI is looking at regional politics across Russia.
Let's talk about that then. So what's going on in the Far East, in the Vladivostok and other areas, and how does that affect Russia's position in the world?
Well, the Russian Far East is a really interesting animal because there is a huge disconnect actually between the regions of the Far East and the capital. Disproportionately poorer density of people. So most people and most infrastructure is kind of concentrated in the west of the country. It's designed to serve Europe. So the big problem when you suddenly impose sanctions on the country is that Russia had suddenly tried to reorientate all its trade towards China. And it can very well say that, but doing that is a whole nother story. One of the problems that tended to happen when you had sort of large Chinese projects before the war was that Chinese companies would bring in all of their local laborers, complete a project, and then go back to China. So it wasn't like it was stimulating the local economy in any way or providing local jobs. So people locally got quite dissatisfied that this was happening. And sometimes Chinese companies weren't granted licenses for drilling and mining. So from the Chinese perspective, that was also a bit unattractive. And to kick off these kind of big projects, the ones that are the long-term investment, big mining, big investment in ports, you need to have a good relationship with the FSB. The security services control most access to licensing procedures, to drilling and all of this. And you've got to keep sort of the regional government suite. You've got to have a good relationship with local contractors. And all of that takes time. And what Russia really needs is investment in its port system. Now, most of Russia's ports in the Far East are already overloaded and at capacity. So it's a huge, huge territory. I think what the Ukraine war has done is really give us a sense of proportion. We're talking about huge bits of territory here in Ukraine, in Russia. It spans 8 time zones, Russia. So to try to be, number one, in control of those borders, and number two, move people and material across it is really, really difficult.
You've painted an incredibly nuanced picture of challenges facing Russia internally. What I want to get at, and I think is going to be very interesting to our mega orderers, is given all of that, how does that affect how Russia makes foreign policy towards Ukraine? How does it affect why it may make nuclear threats towards the UK? How does that affect how it relates to China and Iran? In other words, how does the domestic situation affect Russia's role in the world?
Well, I think they're always inextricably linked, aren't they? Processes that happen internally, so be it a sense of insecurity about your borders, a sense of invasion, because Russia has for centuries always been conscious of those moving borders, whether it's invasion from Mongol hordes or from China or even the Nazis. I think there's always been that threat of encirclement, that kind of siege mentality that people talk about quite a bit. But I think that really does inform not only the domestic control over people's thoughts and movements, and to make sure that the regime is not threatened from within, but also externally. So I think that fear really drives.
There's a fascinating paradox, isn't there, here? If you have the biggest country on earth, you would think you would be less worried about being encircled. But because it's at the heart of the Eurasian landmass, unlike America or Canada surrounded by these oceans, there has been a history of invasion, be it Mongol hordes or Germans or Napoleon. Ergo, despite seemingly being a safe and large and protected area, this fear of encirclement connects to my thesis that the Russians like to disorder other surrounding powers because then those powers can't gang up on them.
Yes, I think that creates a sense of insecurity, that they are the envy of the world and that people want to take what they have. I mean, personally, I think there's a great deal of comparison between, the Russians compare themselves with the West, sometimes, favorably. One of the ways that they exercise control is one of the narratives is, well, the West is this neoliberal decadence that's falling apart, that's eating itself. And we in Russia have this set of values that we stand on, a mix of sort of patriotism and, yes, Christianity in there too, and all of these kind of things that are better than the West. So I think in a lot of ways, Russia always tries to sort of reflect back on the West and uses it as a bit of a mirror. It's a bit strange because, like you said, you would have thought that Russia would be, if it was really comfortable with its position globally, it wouldn't do that. But I think you're right. It reflects a degree of insecurity, and I think that flows through a lot of their foreign policy conversations. But when it comes, to the bilateral relationship with different countries, it's different. The way that Russia feels about the UK, for example, is completely different to the way that the Russians treat the Americans. Russia has a very complicated relationship with us in London that's often a little bit contradictory.
Back to the connections between the domestic situation and Russian foreign policy. I think there was a really interesting point about Russian historical fears of invasion and encirclement. What about just the issues of domestic dysfunction? So is there not something at play in the need to export this conflict? Otherwise, some of the dysfunctions of Russia internally would have consumed the Putin regime from inside?
I see what you're saying. I think in this instance, probably not. Because Putin didn't need this war, actually. He was doing fine in his ratings. The regime is not as brittle. He's not surrounded by so many hostile elements internally. People actually do support him. Yes, there might be sort of some rank and file people that disagree with him, but either out of fear or actual loyalty, it's very poorly expressed. I don't think that there is a need for Russia to export things that go wrong externally. I think the reason for the Ukraine war, there were a few, and we're still debating which one is the big trigger, partly due to Ukraine's suggestion that it might retake Crimea, which Russia saw as a very serious security threat, partly because Ukraine's movements more closely to NATO, partly because Putin had got it into his mind, as we could see, that he felt that Ukraine needed to be a part of Russia. In hindsight, it seemed very clear, but it was very difficult to see whether Putin would actually cross that Rubicon and really go to war over it. But demonstrably, he thought it was important enough. I don't think that was a reflection of personal disorder. I think that things in Russia in 2022 were reasonably stable, or as stable as they could have been.
Well, this gets at my overall critique of realist international relations theory. Leaders and apparatuses and institutions frequently make decisions that are not in their best interest. And it would have been in Putin's best interest to not invade Ukraine. And certainly the average Russian would be wealthier, and he would be more likely to die in his sleep than he is now.
That's because we're thinking at this from a rational Western perspective, where, of course, the cost-benefit analysis is, why would you risk such a huge disruption for something that feels pointless? But in Putin's mindset and in the plane of reality that he does live, it was worth it. It was worth it to make a point that should Ukraine try to move closer to Western security structures, there would be repercussions. They made the point that they were willing to sacrifice people and their international standing in service of a war that very clearly they haven't got what they wanted. But, the lessons that people will draw from the war might be different in a few years' time. And it was important for Putin to get that point across. And I think that security trumped everything else. It trumped common sense. It trumped a lot of the things that people thought, that Russia was an important economic partner. This is what the Germans always thought. They thought that, okay, we've got this Nord Stream pipeline between Germany and Russia. Russia is a good client. We can separate politics from economics. Demonstrably, you can't. And they felt that Russia's huge business relationship and its role as an energy provider would be enough checks and balances on its own to prevent it from upending that relationship, because Russia would have obviously known that had it gone to war, this would happen in some form, that there would be sanctions, that there would be some response from the West, perhaps not the response that they thought, but they would have known that this would have seriously impacted on their relationship with other countries. But it didn't matter. They didn't care, demonstrably.
So let's order the disorder. It will not be easy to de-Putinify Russia. This we know. But what are things that we can be doing and thinking about to help plan for this day when there is no longer Putin?
Well, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? What will somebody in future look like? Will they have an interest in engaging with us? I mean, in London, how well do they rate us? How interested are they in actually having a relationship with the UK? It's a really complicated question to answer. When it comes to what the next person will look like and how we can prepare, well, you need to know about Russia. You need to know what makes them tick. We need to know where sources of instability come from. We need to know who's important. And our Russia strategy kind of needs to reflect that. It needs to reflect, if we're assessing that Russia is probably the greatest threat to European security since, the Second World War, then we need to know that country inside out. And we need to know where its vulnerabilities are, what might be a problem for Russia in future, try to anticipate that, maybe even offer a helping hand in future if we can anticipate that better than the Kremlin. There needs to be a sense of what Russia and the UK can agree on. I'm saying Russia and the UK, but I suppose Russia and the West more broadly is just much more complicated because there's so many different interest groups. But where are areas of cooperation that matter to us all? Things like climate change, things like terrorism, things that we actually did used to cooperate with Russia on. We used to have a NATO-Russia Council, now suspended for obvious reasons. Russia used to be a member of the Arctic Council, also suspended. So there are these kind of hot button issues that you can argue, yes, well, it's very difficult to engage with the Russians. How do we know that they're for real? But we kind of still do. We still need to have some line of discussion, which is why the intelligence, I wouldn't quite call it a relationship, but the link between the American intelligence services and the Russians of late is so important. You might say it might be a bit of an empty gesture. You don't think you're seeing intelligence sharing, but really important to deconflict about major issues so that when there is a problem, you at least know who to talk to.
That's exactly right. Part of ordering the disorder is to create connections where we can pursue shared interests even with our adversaries. And the Arctic or fighting terror are examples where the US and the UK and Russia should be able to work on things. I mean, I've written about Arctic cooperation. As bad as this war gets, it should be, in an ideal world, that we can work together about some issues about the Arctic because they don't have to do with the war and they're all shared interests. And it should be, as bad as the war gets, that if the Russians have some information on some Syrian jihadis that might blow up something in London, that we could share that. Sadly, the world doesn't work that way, but a more orderly world might do so. So what I want to drill down on is, I agree with you. Russia is the greatest threat to British and Western, and to my mind as well, American interests in the world, economic security, and creating the kind of global system that we want. What are things, given this state of conflict that we have, that the British government or that the EU can try to do in its Russia policy if the Americans are not playing ball in trying to act on this threat?
Well, I think that's exactly what the Russians want, which is to try to pry apart the Americans and the Europeans. I include us in that as well, just geographically. A big part of Russia's kind of, disorder and interests in trying to sort of create frictions between different powers is that does play into the West's then inability to make a clear policy on Russia, because there are so many sort of competing issues. The problem is that there are so many countries in Europe that have a very different approach to Russia. And that is by virtue of the fact that they are geographically closer to it. They have a different history. They have deeper or weaker trade relationships with Russia that mean, that sanctions have had more of an impact on those countries than, say, us in the UK. So it's very difficult to have a united Russia policy. And so things like sanctions and rolling them over, even those have been quite difficult. You've got so many different countries that have been arguing for them to be eased on Russia because they're starting to affect their own country. So when you have an America that is completely departing from that playbook, I think there are countries in Europe that actually have welcomed that.
Well, for sure. I mean, there's the Slovakias and the Hungaries who actively wanted that.
Yes. And I think they've been waiting for a voice like that to amplify what they've been saying for a while. And so that can be rather dangerous for European security. It makes us much more fractured. And those in those fractures, Russia can take advantage. So it's important to sort of try to build up some of that unity on perhaps different issues. And having a sort of united approach to Russia, I think, is really, really difficult. So perhaps unilaterally in the UK, our Russia approach needs to be very strong.
And working with those allies whose commitment is unwavering, like Poland, like the Baltics, like the Scandinavians. So what should the UK be doing to counter the threat that Russia poses to the global system?
Well, the threat comes in lots of different formats. There's Russian intelligence penetration, and there is a huge amount of resources going into that. There's Russian organized crime. There's Russian money. There's plenty of things that you can do in the city to tighten those things up. There's, I think, a lack of investment, as far as I can see, in British universities in learning Russian. That's been true for a long time. And certainly since the Soviet period, it's really declined. So why not invest in really good Russia programs at universities and try to train the next generation in getting really good at understanding the country? It's very difficult, especially if you are involved in security, to travel to Russia for obvious reasons. It's dangerous. But one of the first things that tends to be cancelled and destroyed when relationships go sour with countries are things like these British Council exchange programs with students. A lot of those programs were shut down. Why not try to, in the longer term, I'm talking about not immediately while there's a war on, in the longer term, to try to restore some of those education links are a really good way to try to teach the next generation about how Russia works and how people think there. I think going to the country, living in the country and being there and speaking to people is a really important part of that, and being able to do that. And without that experience, it's very difficult, I think, to make a nuanced picture of what Russia wants and what it looks like.
Well, thank you, Emily. You are a true mega orderer at heart, because your way to order the disorder is by asking for more expertise, people who know their subject material in and out, who've lived there, who know the language, who do the thing and have imbibed it. And of course, I couldn't agree more. So, from your mouths to God's ears, and thank you for being with us this week on Disorder. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the Mega Orderer-in-Chief, George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. Hope you enjoyed today's program and hearing the deep expertise of a RUSI scholar. Well, we've got more for you on an even more interesting topic, which is global financial disorder. It's free and open to all. Follow the links in the show notes to attend. That's a wrap. Hope to see you at the live event and hope you have an orderly week. Mega orderers, I need many podcasts these days, not just to hear the rapid-fire news, but to break down how could all this be happening to us. And someone I turn to is Jordan Harbinger. His show was previously named one of Apple's best. We had him on episode 69, Life in North Korea, Kidnapping Stories, and Why Symbolism Matters with Dictators. And that pretty much tells you all you need to know about how the Jordan Harbinger show works. He has deep dive interviews dealing with things like psychology, self-help. He might talk to an FBI negotiator about trust. And he draws on some of our top table disorder guests like Anne Applebaum to think about why disorderers like Iran and Russia can work together. I'm sure you'll love it. So search The Jordan Harbinger Show wherever you get your podcasts.